The United States, An Outline of Political History, 1492 to 1871, by Goldwin Smith, 1893. Chapter 1, page 2. Columbus was also a devotee of a religion with more in it of Rome and of the Crusades than of the gospel, and with more of the forms of devotion than of spirit. Morally, he was a type of the age which came between the fall of the Catholic and the rise of the Protestant faith, and had for its head Alexander VI, the moral monster of the papacy, whose hand had signed the bull which divided the New World between two Catholic powers. In his youth, it seems he served on board a pirate fleet. He began his intercourse with the natives of America by kidnapping, and he gave the word for the opening of the slave trade. He became the father of a line of adventurers who, like himself, were gold seekers or seekers of lucre, gilding their rapacity with the same profession of zeal for the extension of religion, who sacked Mexico and Peru, trampled to pieces there under the hoofs of conquest the highest development of Indian civilization, worked to death the soft inhabitants of the American islands, and replaced them by the importation of African slaves. None of these adventurers looked upon America as a new home, or thought of founding a nation. The Huguenots might have founded a nation in Florida had they not been massacred by the Spaniards. But the aim of the Jesuit was not to found a nation. In the settlement of Virginia by Sir Walter Raleigh, and when Raleigh's romantic enterprise had failed, by a company of commercial adventurers, lucre, if not gold-seeking, was still the predominant motive. Of 143 settlers sent out, a large proportion were broken-down gentlemen seeking to repair their fortunes. A few only were laborers or mechanics. The rest were servants. Let me throw in a note that servants is a nice little word that you keep finding when they refer to white people as slaves. I couldn't think of a better way of saying it, but that's it. They just exchange words. Slaves are for everybody else. Servants are for whites. It's still slaves. Moving on. To show how faint was their purpose of settlement, they brought no women. The subsequent reinforcements were of the same kind, with some goldsmiths and refiners to help in seeking for gold where no gold was. Food these colonists had to beg or steal from the Indians. To the crew of vagabonds were afterwards added jailbirds. Now let me throw in that I'll throw in a neat little section on my notes later on in here about that. Convicts were offered their choice between the gallows and Virginia, and some, we are told, chose the gallows. It had been started on the false principle of joint stock industry, which deprives labor of its mainspring, especially if everybody is an owner and nobody's a worker. Yeah, it doesn't look like today, does it? John Smith, its first explorer, had given the name of New England at a spot which they named Plymouth, after the English port of the name from which they had sailed. A chartered company, the usual organ of a commercial venture in those days, formed the English basis of their enterprise and the source of needful supplies. Their language is instinct with the simple heroism of their enterprise. Let it not be grievous to you, said their friends in England, that you have been instruments to break the ice for others. The honor shall be yours to the world's end. The world's end, the honor is theirs. If Columbus discovered the new continent, they discovered the new world. Let a mariner land and set up a flag on a strange shore. Let him even sight that shore from his vessel. The whole region, thenceforth, according to the European law of nations, belonged to his sovereign, and was that sovereign's to grant to whom he pleased. His Majesty of England, by his charter, granted North America, so far as it was then known, by between certain degrees of latitude, in full property, with exclusive rights of jurisdiction, settlement, and traffic, to certain persons incorporated respectively as the London and Plymouth companies. The Pope's pretension to divide the New World between Catholic powers was hardly more baseless. The founders of Massachusetts were not, when they came out, independents like the Company of the Mayflower, but Puritans in the proper sense of the term, that is, members of the Church of England who desired to remain within her pale, but to purify her from the vestiges of Rome, and at the same time uplift her to a higher standard of Christian life. But practical divorce from the Anglican hierarchy and ordinances, together with the liberating air of the New World, soon made them, like the Plymouth immigrants, independents. From Charles I, who was no doubt glad to see the Puritan spirit carried off by immigrations, the Massachusetts Company received a liberal charter, which became the palladium of advancing independence. The colony was an object of fervent interest to the Puritans at home, and was recruited with some of their best blood. Hither the excellent Cotton led from Boston in Lincolnshire, and the fair church that rises over it, a part of us flocked to a Boston which soon became, and has remained, the center of New England and the focus of New England civilization. Hither came Hugh Peters, the chaplain that was to be of the regicide republic. Hither for a time came Henry Vane, as has been said, young in years, but not yet in sage counsel old, for he brought with him a disquieting ambition. The first governor was Winthrop, a wealthy Sussex gentleman, who left his manor house at the age of 42 to help in planting a gospel kingdom in the New World. He was a noble specimen of the Puritan character, uniting with its force the gentle grace which Mrs. Hutchinson has portrayed in her picture of Colonel Hutchinson, a wise counselor, skillful as Hampden in the management of men, and in all distractions piously serene. Endicott and Dudley were Puritans of the sterner type. Besides Cotton, other clergymen came, highly educated at Oxford or Cambridge, more from Cambridge than from Oxford, because Cambridge lay in the eastern counties, the home of Cromwell and the Ironsides. The inflow of Puritan life did not cease till the rising of the English nation against Charles, and Laud gave the party hope and work at home. No one could be a citizen of Massachusetts who was not in close communion with one of the churches. The churches were organized on the congregational principle, forming a group, each member of which was independent of the rest and chose its own pastor. But they were bound together by complete sympathy. Identity of doctrine and of system was preserved, and discipline was practically enforced by them in concert. Baptism was limited to the children of those who were in close communion, and only to those who were in close communion was the sacrament of the Lord's Supper administered. Every citizen was required to contribute to the maintenance of a church. Thus not only was there a union of church and state, but church and state were one. The clergy were the leaders to a considerable extent. They were the masters of the Puritan society and commonwealth. Massachusetts led the world in the institution of common schools, to which all citizens were required to contribute, and which all citizens were required to use. Common schools, they were in the true sense of the term in that realm of equality, used as well as maintained by all. The reason given for instituting them was that children might be able to read the scriptures aright, notwithstanding the wiles of Satan, whose favorite device was misinterpretation. Of the intruders, the most memorable was Roger Williams, a quick-witted, warm-hearted, and somewhat flighty Welshman, who came preaching absolute freedom of conscience and denouncing theocratic government. A political as well as a religious innovator, he denied the right of the king to grant the land and thus impugned the titles of the colonists. In his zeal against idolatry, he compromised the loyalty of the colony by persuading the governor to cut the cross as a popish emblem out of the flag. He was expelled after much tribulation and went to found Rhode Island on the principle of perfect religious freedom and complete separation of church from state, of which, partly perhaps schooled by persecution, he had become the memorable champion. His colony may boast itself the first of all commonwealths in which liberty of conscience was the law. Miss Anne Hutchinson also presented herself in Massachusetts. Her opinions appear to have been antinomian. Certainly they were anti-clerical and anti-theocratic. From the active part which she took, and the leadership to which she aspired, notwithstanding her sex, in theological agitation, she may be regarded as a harbinger of the revolt of woman. Vane, who was in New England at the time, was drawn to her, and it seems to have been partly in this way that he was led into an antagonism to the ruling party in Massachusetts, which, combined probably with the attractions of the larger field, sent him back to the old country. Miss Hutchinson was also banished. Samuel Gorton was another eccentric spirit who could not brook theocratic rule. He held, among other heresies, that there was no such place as heaven or hell, a doctrine for which the time was not ripe. Disturbing the existing order and defying the rulers, he, with his followers, was convicted of blasphemy and with more cruelty expelled. Baptists, when they found their way into the colony, were regarded and suffered as disturbers of the religious order. They carried with them, however, undeservedly, the taint of the social anarchy and war produced by the wild uprisings of the Anabaptists in Europe. The worst case, and the shame of the theocracy, is that of the Quakers. Quakers were not at first harmless people of the inner light, with a prim dress and a precise language of their own. They were sectaries of the wildest kind, and were sometimes guilty in their religious ecstasy of indecency and even of outrage. They railed against church authority, they forced themselves into places of worship and disturbed the service. They went about naked to testify against sin. A Quakeress in Massachusetts thrust herself upon a meeting house clad in sackcloth and with her face painted black to represent the coming of the smallpox. Quakers were sternly bidden to depart, laws making them liable to flogging and imprisonment, to the cropping of their ears, and the piercing of their tongues with hot irons, were passed, and in some cases cruelly carried into execution. In defiance of these penalties, they still came, till at last a law was passed banishing them on pain of death. They returned, eager for martyrdom, and 4 of them were hanged. Public sentiment revolted. Rhode Island, however, had now an opportunity of showing her loyalty to her newborn principle of religious freedom. To the appeal of Massachusetts for cooperation in putting down the Quakers, the people of Rhode Island replied that they had no law among them whereby to punish any for only declaring words, their minds and understandings concerning the things and ways of God as to salvation and an eternal condition. They admitted that the doctrines of the Quakers tended to very absolute cutting down and overturning relations and the civil government among men, but said that experience taught them that in those places where these people aforesaid, in this colony, are most all suffered to declare themselves freely, and are only opposed by arguments and discourse, there they the least of all desire to come, inasmuch as they delight to be persecuted by civil powers, and when they are, so they are like to gain more adherents by the conceit of their patient suffering than by the consent to their pernicious sayings. In one respect, the Rhode Islanders were mistaken. The Quakers remained among them and added to the disturbance of their settlement. Unlike the dependencies of Spain or France, Massachusetts was from the outset practically a republic, albeit retaining her allegiance to the King of England, founding her rights upon his charter, included in his declarations of war and his treaties of peace, regarding his law as the basis of her own, and recognizing his Privy Council as her ultimate court of appeal. Her polity was based on the township, the elementary cell and school of public life, about which much has been said by de Tocqueville and other political philosophers. The townships were afterwards gathered into counties, forming another step in the ascending scale of self-government. Representation went with taxation. Its chiefs, in fact, repudiated democracy as not a fit government either for church or state. They asked if the people were to govern, who was to be governed? Now let me throw in there, there's much left unsaid in that sentence, and it is exactly how your government, city, county, state, and federal works right now. Some of them would fain have had all offices held for life. Winthrop and Dudley did actually enjoy almost a life term. There was no idle aristocracy. All alike were workers, but social distinctions were kept up. Now let me throw in that what comes next is very important. The order of gentlemen was recognized. It was exempted from corporal punishment. The title of Mr. M.R. period was confined to it, Goodman being the title of a commoner. The principal, now let me throw in the word principal here and in other places is of the spelling of creditor or debtor or of the founders. It's commercial spelling, okay? The principal families had the chief seats in church. Their sons ranked first among the students at Harvard. Important. Here comes another good one. Concerning liberty, said Governor Winthrop in a homily against Democratic turbulence, I observe a great mistake in the country. There is a twofold liberty. Natural, I mean as our nature is now corrupt, and civil or federal. The first is common to man with beasts and other creatures. By this, man, as he stands in relation to man, simply hath liberty to do what he lists. It is a liberty to evil as well as to good. This liberty is incompatible and inconsistent with authority and cannot endure the least restraint of the most just authority. Now let me throw in here, as always, the magic of whose just authority. Who will be the judge of that? They're decrying the natural order so they can institute their own. Licensed liberty is no liberty at all, because it does not give me anything I do not already have. Moving on, the exercise and maintaining of this liberty makes men to grow more evil, and in time to be worse than brute beasts. Omne summa licentia deterarius. We all become worse by license. The actual translation is we are all worse than the license which is generally granted by a higher authority. It is proceeding upon the fallacious logic that all are corrupted in the beginning and must work the debt off. Translation 2, that knowledge from the span of centuries that you, the circumstances and leaders, we all have. That is the great enemy of truth and peace, that wild beast which all the laws of God are bent against, to restrain and subdue it. The other kind of liberty I call civil or federal. It may also be called moral, in reference to the covenant between God and man in the moral law, and the political covenants and constitutions among men themselves. This liberty is the proper end and object of authority, and cannot subsist without it. And it is a liberty to that only which is just, good, and honest. Let me throw in, I hope so, because he's telling you how it's going to go. You don't got no choice. This liberty you are to stand for at the hazard not only of your goods, but of your lives if need be. Whatsoever crosseth this is not authority, but a distemper thereof. This liberty is maintained and exercised in a way of subjection to authority. It is of the same kind of liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free. Now, I'm going to throw in a note here that I don't know who this silly bastard thought he was trying to screw, but he's a corporate huckster, shill and a hack. There's no way in hell that's what Jesus Christ said. But I'm going to leave that one go. This is how they've always gamed you people. But now you know. Moving on. Authority was surrounded with as much state as the infant colony could afford. The governor, it seems, was preceded by 4 halberdiers. Now let me throw in, earlier he said, the aristocracy, they were not idle, they had to work. If by work you mean sit inside of your house and issue paper bulls all the time or get preceded by 4 halberdiers, then yeah, it sounds like it was rough for them. When Lord Say and Selle, Lord Brooke, and other Puritan noblemen thought of coming out from England, they proposed that Massachusetts should institute a hereditary order of nobility forming an upper house. But this the Commonwealth respectfully declined. But aristocracy, had it been planted in New England, could never have taken root. In the colony, there was no great estates to support peerages. Now, let me throw in not until the Revolution, that is. And actually, he contradicts himself, the author here, quite a bit. Okay? Companies built this. Families and blood and the corporations go hand in hand. It's all the same thing, okay? And anyway, of the equal comradeship of Saxon rovers, English self-government was born. In the equal partnership of religious colonists, after 1,000 years of monarchy and aristocracy, it was renewed. Important, listen. The company having been transferred from England to Massachusetts, no tie to England was left but that of allegiance to the king. They moved their headquarters to Massachusetts. Elections were by the democratic mode of ballot. We see the rudiment of a democratic caucus. Self-taxation is the political lever of a democracy. And New Englanders jealously refused to pay any taxes without representation. It was a democratic spirit that demanded a written code of laws instead of Mosaic principles administered at the discretion of the general court. It was a democratic spirit that successfully protested against life tenure of office. So, no matter the form, who keeps asking for the changes and getting them? It's not you, but it's the representatives. Now, we already know about voting. So who do they represent? You already know who owns all this. That's right. It's not hard, is it? Okay. And now, of course, as the population increased, part of the game model is to bust up life tenures so everybody gets to rotate through the system. That actually makes you think you're doing something. when in fact you're doing nothing at all except making sure the system keeps going. Miss Sherman's sow. We have here a glimmering of the conflict to come in after times between the classes and the masses. He, Miss Sherman's antagonist in the suit, being accounted a rich man and she a poor woman, this so wrought with the people as being blinded with unreasonable compassion they could not see or would not allow justice her reasonable course. A feeling of the deputies of the townships came against the central power, likewise premonitory in its way, seems also to have played its part. To the learned and revered Cotton, who held that democracy was not a fit government for church or state, was opposed the learned and revered Thomas Hooker, who maintained that the foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people, and the choice of the public magistrates belongs to the people of God's own allowance, and that they have the power to appoint officers and magistrates. And magistrates have the right also to set the bounds and limitation of the power and place unto which they call them. Now, it sounds really weird because of the times that they used, was different type of speech patterns. But anyway, basically, God will sort it out. Don't worry about it. He'll appoint somebody. There's nothing wrong with God. Just don't, I hate to tell you, don't sign on, don't contract with another man's God, and you're good to go. These sentiments Hooker and his friends embodied in the Constitution of Connecticut, a settlement which was in some measure a democratic secession from Massachusetts, and may thus claim to be the cradle of American democracy, as Rhode Island may claim to be the cradle of liberty of conscience. We have passed from the world of unwritten to that of written constitutions, from a world of government by usage, tradition, and chartered privileges wrested from kings to a world of government by public reason embodied in codes of political law. So if you're ever wondering if everything is a political subdivision of the political government, then all codes are political. That's it. That's all there is to this. 1642. A federation was formed of the 4 colonies then in existence: Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven. The motive was the same which has given birth to confederations in general: mutual defense against hostile force. The hostile force in this case being that of the Dutch, who pressed from the south, and that of the French Canadians, who pressed from the north, while there was always a danger from the Indians. In the instrument of federation, the language used implied the possession by the contracting parties of independent and sovereign power, such as would enable them to make peace and war. Massachusetts, being much larger and stronger than her 3 sisters, and naturally claiming influence in proportion to her contribution, domineered, or was believed by her partners to domineer, and instead of harmonious action there was strife. Now, at any time, show me where you had the right to vote in any of this, or that you wrote the laws, codes, or constitutions instead of plantation and estate owners and holders, the corporations. And you'll suddenly begin to realize how little you've played other than cannon fodder in this entire theatrical game show. Important, the belief that the scriptures contained the rule of civil as well as that of spiritual life, coupled with the belief that the Old Testament was of equal authority with the New, could not fail to sit heavy on the Puritans of New England, as well as those of the mother country. Now let me throw in the screw job of Constantine, both councils of Nicaea, Manes and the Manichaeans, all the different purges and the sects, and then you got to throw in King James and both of his rewrites of the Bible. So I don't want to hear anything about the Old and the New Testament even being remotely discussed as if they are the same thing. They are not. Okay? So, that's just me, though. Their legislation was tainted with Mosaism. Blasphemy, witchcraft, adultery, smiting or cursing parents were treated as capital crimes, though we have no record of an infliction of the death penalty for blasphemy, adultery, or filial rebellion. For death as the punishment in the case of adultery was afterwards substituted a milder penalty, a part of which was the wearing of the scarlet letter A as a mark of infamy. Now remember, this is all social reconstruction. They're using the religious model to see how well it works out. The company is using that. Okay? All right. The Code of Massachusetts and those of the other New England colonies are on the whole a great improvement on those of the mother country in humanity and civilization. Let me throw in, unless you were a part of it, okay, especially if you're the one getting burnt at the Salem witch trial. So now, let's throw that out. Their use of the death penalty is sparing indeed compared with the use of it in the code of the mother country, where at last there were 160 capital offenses. Cruelty to animals was forbidden. Though I'll tell you this, I don't know why the law needs to do that, because you never whip or beat up or treat like shit an animal that you're going to have to use to feed you or keep you alive. That's all there is to it. But some people are stupid and actually need those codes, okay? Now, they're stupid because the system keeps them stupid, all right? They don't. Why would you think a thing through when the system's going to tell you how to do it anyway? All right. Okay, anyway, so the system gives you a crutch, you use the crutch, and you're always disabled mentally. Though equality did not yet fully reign, there was enough of it to prevent aristocratic prodigality of the blood of the poor. In other words, keeping the poor out of the loop. Remember, because as much as we hate material possession in all these different churches and religions, it's important enough that you had better possess property or you don't get a right to vote. You ain't a part of us, you know. Imprisonment for debt was discarded. Now, the ensnaring technicalities of the pleading system were relaxed. Now, some of you will like that, Psycho Drill and the rest of you, anti-terrorists and everybody. The ensnaring technicalities of the pleading system were relaxed. Okay, there's a whole bunch said in that one sentence. Okay, now the imprisonment for debt was discarded. What do you call imprisonment? All right, that's where they start shift words around, okay, to force you to more voluntarily work for them. You'll see that later in here. Women were protected against the violence of their husbands, and a share of the husband's good was secured to the widow. Okay, so you can tell the kook feminazis that they're full of shit. Such reforms Cromwell would have probably have made in England had he been able to overcome the interested prejudices of his lawyers. Now, I won't go into Cromwell, but quite a few of you are well-versed in Cromwell, I would imagine. The celebration of marriage, which the Puritan deemed no sacrament, was transferred from the clergyman to the magistrate. That is, now I'm going to throw this in, that's the beginnings of the binding marriage to the state. In other words, the binding third-party contract with the state. Because instead of you doing it, and instead of you and the church doing it, everything's slowly sliding off onto the magic, quote, state, unquote. Okay. Barbarous punishments such as flogging, setting in the stocks, tongue boring, and ear cropping were still in vogue. Okay. New Haven was somewhat more Mosaic and sterner than Boston. It had been founded by men for whom Boston was too little Puritan, and who were called the Brahmins of the sect. So that one's for Mr. Alan Watt. They were called the Brahmins of the sect. Yes, Brahmins would be Vedas, India. All right. Its chief rulers were styled the Seven Pillars, and it rejected jury trial as unsanctioned by the scriptures. The blue laws of Connecticut are at all events a fable. Now he doesn't specify or go into detail there. Under the discipline of Puritan theocracy combined with the training of industry and of bold seafaring, the foundations of a strong character were laid. All right, now, as you go through here, you got to remember social reconstruction, social training, social education. It's taking you, oh, hey, he's just a slave anyway. Nobody cares about him. Let's train him to do this in our corporation. That's all this is. That's all this is. And we'll send him out later, and he can fight with the Indians and get us more land. And we'll just say we own it. They're too stupid. They ain't never going to catch it. Well, a lot of people did catch it and left. They don't tell you those stories, though. Anyway, the Puritan colonists, now listen close to this one. The Puritan colonists had begun with common ownership of land, and it did not stick. Now, here's the reason he's going to tell you it didn't stick. I know why it didn't stick. Because common ownership is not good for a corporation. That shit ain't going to fly. All right? Somebody's got to be in charge and making a profit. They soon found that, let me put that common ownership is great for a tiny tribe, a tiny deal. And it can work in a giant country. The deal is they don't want that, so it ain't going to fucking happen. So anyway, they soon found that common ownership meant common neglect and hunger, as had the colonists of Virginia till a leader by sheer force compelled them to work. No, that's not what it was. There's no profit to be had in that when you and I figure out that we can work 4 hours a week between 5 of us. Right? Well, we're not going to go out and conquer and kill off all the Indians and ship gold and timber back to the home country, so some asshole can make a profit, so they can invade another country. So that's got to go. That's gone. All right. They then divided, now here is your system right now. They then divided the land into lots. After which, now who owns this shit? Nobody owns this shit, right? The Indians own this shit. But you'll find the excuse for that later. But they divided the land in lots, just like you got right now, in the political subdivision of your county and your cities. How could they? They can't possibly own that. But they're going to say, well, we're only going to allow you to buy this lot or that lot, or, it's stupid. It's just stupid. But anyway, they do however they want. They then divided the land into lots, after which industry became strenuous. In other words, they screwed the system up so it's not easy. You have to work 14 hours a day because you wouldn't work for them otherwise. It's just like the typewriter. If you ever read any of the old stories about the typewriter keys, when they first came out with the typewriter, they found that secretaries could complete their work so fast that they would sit around and not have no work, so they redesigned the keyboard to slow them down. I swear to God, that's a story I heard. Well, whether true or not, that's exactly what they did to your entire political system. It's not supposed to work. So you'll spend all your life, or half of your life, wasting time inside something that is so inefficient it's unreal. That's how it is. Otherwise, you'd walk the fuck away. But anyway, after which industry became strenuous, and there was food enough. Just food enough. Okay, food enough. Some common land, however, was retained magically. And the lovely public gardens of Boston are a monument of the primitive system. An attempt was made to regulate the rate of wages, and when the wage earners complained of their reduced power of purchasing, an attempt was made to regulate prices also. Even under a theocracy, both experiments failed. And actually, they didn't fail. What they found out is they couldn't make enough profit. Like what we have right now. If you give me $20 an hour, and me and you, let's say you're my boss, and I'm your wage earner. If you give me $20 an hour, we pretty much have to swear to each other we'll never tell anybody else. Because once the bread manufacturer learns that he can make an extra $5 on a loaf of bread, you're fucked. Everybody it gets fucked, and up it goes. So, yes, bread's not worth anything anyway if I can make it myself. It's not worth $1 a loaf. It's not. Especially if you don't sit around eating bread all fucking day. But here we go into this. Yeah, you see everybody gaming everybody else. But anyway, the experiments didn't fail. What it was, they just didn't have balls enough to do it and keep control of it that way. They wanted to make a profit. Always a profit. Expansion, expansion, expansion. All right? And doing it like that, you would slow down your industry naturally and just naturally deal with each other. Well, they can't have that. It's got to be constant agitation. Bernie Mandeville, okay? Philly Freneau is not new. Thus, these pioneers of trade and industry in their day. Now, who is the pioneers of the trade and industry? They're not talking about you. You weren't the one out sailing the ships. You didn't have money for a ship. You were best press ganged, right? Stolen off street. So who are they talking about? Oh, yeah, these captains of industry at that time. In their day, relegated political... Now, this is... You'll like this one. This is also for Mr. Alan Watt. Thus, these pioneers of trade and industry in their day relegated political economy to Saturn and found that it returned. A better measure was the enactment that no house should be built at more than a certain distance from a place of worship. If the primary object of this law was ecclesiastical, it brought with it the economical and moral advantages of a close settlement. It favored the growth of towns and therefore of social and political life. It kept everybody under the boot. Life was, of course, austere. That's for Mr. Watt, too. Much in which Merry England delighted and might well delight was forbidden. There were no maypoles nor Christmas pies. There was no theater. The acting even of Comus would not have been endured. There were no drinkings of health, and of course no cards nor dice. On the other hand, there was no bear baiting, no cockfighting, now this one I don't know, no cocking on Shrove Tuesday. No beastly drinking about, no beating of watchmen, no outrage of aristocratic Mohawks. Now, this is interesting. It's spelt M-O-H-O-C-K-S, Mohawks, not the Indians. That's very interesting. Its preachers had their casks of rum or brandy. Oh, yes, indeed. They did. You didn't. Frugality as well as religious principle would check excess of all kinds and force you to keep working, even when riches had increased. Else denial of amusement is apt to lead to greater indulgence in the pleasures of the table. They're talking about, they're talking about company, how to manage men, how to manage them. And you got to do it in minutia. Fractionalize the Ponzi scams. More and more, complicate it more and more and more. Anyway, still, New England life must have been austere. Now, this, Mr. Watt knows this one. A good slave who is poor makes a better, richer, highly taxed slave, too, later on. Because they're dumb enough to just keep doing it for less and less. Except now you're going to work for whatever they tell you. You won't even grow your own food, so you just go to the store and buy it and it'll kill you, and nobody fucking cares. That's stupid. The religious exercises were such as would far surpass our powers of pious endurance. That's right. In other words, they're saying, they were really tough old-timers. Yes, they were. They were just about smart enough to fall for that bullshit. That doesn't mean they weren't physically tough. Hell yeah, they fought Indians with their bare hands and all tomahawks and stuff. But then again, they were stealing their shit. So, 6 of one, half dozen the other. But the point is, you couldn't handle what they had to go through. They have no idea what the fuck the internet is back then, now do they? Right? They don't have to deal with paper money like what. That's what I'm saying. So ignore all that. It's not your generation. None of that shit is yours anyway. It's just something they're selling to you all the time. So anyway, they're the same as you. Okay? Could any but the liveliest faith have drunk in with delight the interminable sermon of a Calvinistic pastor in an unwarmed meeting house with temperature below zero? This is very important. I want you to listen to this. New England was not free from the stain of slavery. Now, what comes next is vitally important, okay? Vitally important that you listen. The law of Massachusetts said, there shall be no bond slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us, unless it be lawful captives, taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. That is your 13th and 14th Amendments in the Bill of Rights. Or feel free to read Treaties on American Citizenship or Joe's Story on Notes, especially securities, and that of the law of agency. It's still on the books, and they cannot tell you that there is no slavery. What they're saying is you willingly sell yourselves to them. All right, now I've proved all that shit time and time again, and they can't. You can't argue. Nobody's going to factually disprove me on that. But right there it says, hey, as long as you sell yourself to us, we don't care. It ain't slavery. This licenses slavery and slave trade, though the provision which grants to the slave, listen to this, the provision which grants to the slave all the liberties and Christian usages which the law of God established in Israel. The Hebrew code, having been merciful for its day, would render slavery in New England comparatively mild, because it is slavery by contract. That's right. Slavery was sanctioned by the Bible. That was enough for the Puritan. Now, I'm going to throw in it was not sanctioned by the Bible. It was sanctioned in the Old Testament, which is not the New Testament. Now, I went through that earlier. Maine's Manicheans, Constantine, both councils of Nicaea, smashing together the Old and New Testaments as if they were the same thing. They weren't. King James proved it not once, but twice when he had it rewrote. So out goes that. Ships from New England took part in the slave trade, though the members of the religious commonwealth who made a murderous raid upon the African village on the Sabbath were brought to justice for their double crime. Fortunately for New England, she had no industry like that of cotton, tobacco, or rice in which slave labor could be profitably employed. Slaves do not make good husbandmen or seamen. Relations with the Aborigines. Now, I'm going to throw in, he means Indians. You'll hear it in Canada. The kooks in Canada will use the words Aborigines, or Australia, and by here it means natives or Indians, okay? It's an English thing. Are a sad page in the history of the colonies. At the time of the American secession, the charge was revived against the New England Puritans of exterminating the natives on a hideous scale, which they did. There were tribes that just ceased to exist. All right, just all of them, they don't exist no more. Some, in fact, ceased to exist. We're talking a year or two before Lewis and Clark came through. And they were asked, oh, yeah, there used to be a tribe over there that we knew. And why? You want to talk to them? Well, you can't. They ain't here no more. They got wiped out by smallpox. Or a band come through, somebody come through and wiped them out. Compensation of some sort was made for the lands taken from the natives. Though while, W-I-L-E, while, your brains, on the one hand, mere roaming over a vast region could hardly make the Indian hunter its proprietor. On the other, nothing could compensate the wandering hunter for the loss of the wilderness and the game. But again, the sheer fucking stupidity. The sheer fucking retardation in the heads of these English motherfuckers to think that you can just drive by a tree and claim that son of a bitch is yours and kill everyone within 1,000 miles because of it. I shit you not. People are fucking retarded. Just eat up in the fucking brain pan. And these are your college professors and everybody else that would justify wiping each other out. Now, hey, don't get mad at the Indians. I'm talking they used your stupid ass, right? Your contracted, indentured servitude, press-ganged, white ass. They used you, right? So I'm just saying, they've always done to you what they did to everybody else. Okay? Nor did the settlers ever cease to recognize the Indian as a man having a right to justice against the Englishman. The missionary efforts of, and now I'll tell you this, of course they said that you have a right to justice against the Englishman. Oh, by the way, you don't have firearms, so what the fuck does that matter? Right. The missionary efforts of Eliot were fully as noble as those of Las Casas or the Jesuits, while they were not, like those of the Jesuits, tainted with an equivocal ambition. Important. This is for the Alan Watt crowd. He strove to combine civilization with conversion and aimed at making his converts men, not sheep. But the Red Indian, in reality, though not in the romance of Fenimore Cooper, was of all savages the most irreclaimable. In other words, they refused to submit, which is good for the English because they wiped them out. Wild virtues, notably fortitude, he had, as well as the keenness of sense and power of endurance. But his life was full of slaughter and rapine. His cruelty, or rapine, his cruelty was fiendish. In the Iroquois, the devilish lust of blood and torture was so ingrained and was combined with so much cunning and perfidy, which I always like that word, that it was scarcely possible to deal with him otherwise than as with the most dangerous and untamable of wild beasts, which all of that's bullshit. They had to justify rooting them out so they could take their land. That's all this is. I'll get into it later here in a little bit. The Puritan also had his cruel moods and his notions about smiting the Canaanite in New England as well as in Ireland. He was in one of those moods when, in the Pequod War, he destroyed in one Holocaust 400 Indians, men, women, and children. Yet more terrible was the later days against the Indian chief called King Philip, who, as the colonists believed, had been forming a league to drive them out of the land. This war lasted for 2 years, during which nearly 2/3 of the 80 or 90 towns of Massachusetts were raided by the savages, 10 or 12 were totally destroyed, and 10% of the men of military age were killed in fight or carried off to be tortured to death. Now, I'm going to throw in the full of shit. There was other things in there, all right? They would capture you and make you part of the tribe. That's well known. But they don't want to speak about a whole bunch of stuff. But anyway, for the Mr. Watt crowd again, no wonder if disturbed fancy added its terrors to those of reality. If Indian bows were seen in the sky and scalps in the moon. If the aurora borealis was taken for a blood-red portent of coming war. Now, I'm going to ask something. I don't live up there. How the hell, if you're living in New England, do you see the aurora borealis? Or is it a figure of speech? Interesting, right? All right. The Anglo-Saxon is to lower races a ruler, and in dealing with them, his exclusiveness is at once his strength and his weakness. Massachusetts has always professed allegiance to the British Crown, which, and not Parliament, it must be remembered in those days was or was taken to be the real government. In other respects, she always bore herself as an independent and almost sovereign commonwealth. She made war and peace. She formed a confederation. She taxed herself, paying not tribute of any kind. She coined her own money, the pine tree shilling. She dealt freely with her own constitution. She framed her own code of laws, including the law of capital punishment, though as a general basis the English common law prevailed. She framed her own treason law, enacting that if any man rebel or conspire against the Commonwealth, or should attempt the alteration or subversion of her fundamental government, he should suffer death. The smaller Puritan colonies in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, pervaded by the same spirit as Massachusetts, like her, were bent on enjoying practical independence. They, especially Rhode Island, had less difficulty in obtaining a large measure of it, since the Crown was inclined to make them its allies against Massachusetts, whose ambitious aspirations and hostility to Episcopalianism, the royal religion, combined with its power, gave special umbrage to the Crown. As Protestants militant, the New Englanders were bound up with the fortunes of their cause in Europe. With eager eyes they had watched the victorious career of Gustavus Adolphus. With eyes still more eager would they watch the struggle in their mother country between high church despotism and Protestant liberty. They triumphed in the victory of the Parliament. Presbyterianism, dominant for the time in England, and believing as firmly as did Popery or Anglicanism in its divine origin, would fain have extended its dominion to the colonies. A synod of the Massachusetts churches was held, and the Westminster Confession was approved, but the congregational theocracy of New England underwent no change. The policy of the Protector towards the colonists was large-minded and liberal. He offered them, instead of their niggard soil and chilly climate, the rich and sunny Jamaica. At another time he proposed to transplant them to Ireland. Happily, they declined both offers. In Jamaica, they would have sunk into slave owners. In Ireland, they would have had to make room for themselves by smiting the Canaanites of that land with the edge of the sword. New England accepted the restoration, but did not welcome it. After more than a year's delay, Charles II was proclaimed at Boston, but to drink his health was not allowed, his Majesty himself having strictly forbidden it, as the rulers, by a pious fiction, declared. The colony gave an asylum to the regicides Whalley, Gough, and Dixon, who, hunted by royal emissaries, were sheltered by popular sympathy. A cave near New Haven is still shown as the refuge of Gough and Whalley. By this time, however, a change had come over the spirit of Massachusetts herself. Trade had grown active, wealth had increased, and there had arisen a class more commercial than religious, which lusted after the flesh pots, material and social, of the royal and Anglican Egypt. Again, austerity, often tainted with conceit and sometimes with hypocrisy. A reaction was sure to take place like that of the Restoration against the reign of the saints in England. Political and religious malcontents alike, royalists, Episcopalians, Baptists, and Quakers, turned their eyes to Westminster, and there urged their complaints and carried on their intrigues. The germs of the Tory and Whig parties of the Revolution had been formed. This invited the despotic aggression of the later Stuarts, the pine tree shilling being an offensive token of monetary independence. The pine was ingeniously passed off as the royal oak. The agents of Massachusetts brought back with them a royal missive demanding the repeal of all laws inconsistent with the king's authority, the administration of justice in his name, the renewal of the oath of allegiance, the substitution of property qualifications for church membership as the title to the franchise and to office, and the admission of all people of honest views to baptism and the Lord's Supper, the two last articles importing nothing less than the abolition of theocracy. Now let me throw in, doesn't that sound like the 14th Amendment? It sure does. Let everybody come in. That doesn't make you a citizen. It makes you think you are, though. Thus, in the colony, as in the mother country, the Romanizing Stuart figured in a sinister way as the patron of toleration. The Quakers, however, though the king at first gave ear to their complaints, obtained little relief in the end. They filled the Stuarts' own prisons. Royalty had in the colony its party arrayed against the zealous defenders of the theocracy and headed by Joseph Dudley, son of the stern Puritan governor, but himself a shifty politician, the counterpart of the Lauderdales and the Shaftesburys of the mother country. Besides the threatened change in her constitution, Massachusetts was menaced with a blow to her territorial ambition by a decision adverse to her aggrandizement in Maine, the proprietary colony of Sir Ferdinando Jorge, which she had been striving to appropriate. Relief from pressure was probably afforded to the colony by the reaction against the court in England consequent on the Popish plot, which gave birth to the Exclusion Bill. A quo warranto went forth. All right, now let me explain quo warranto, which is by whose authority. The charter of Massachusetts, like the charters of the English municipalities, was annulled, and by a colorable process of law, for the later Stuarts did everything in form of law, the Commonwealth was reduced to a dependency under the arbitrary power of the Crown, which by the same act became again Lord of all the land, and had the title of every freeholder legally at its mercy. Under James II, the colony narrowly escaped having the sanguinary Kirk as its governor. Sir Edmund Andros came out in that capacity instinct with the spirit of his master. He appeared as governor of the whole of New England, and apparently as destined governor-general of all the colonies. Under him, as president of the council, was Joseph Dudley, playing Sunderland to the viceroy of James II. Andros, like his master, assumed the despot. He levied arbitrary taxes. He compelled freeholders to purchase new patents for their lands. And if they complained, he told them, with the insolence of another Jeffreys, by the mouth of his deputy, that they had nothing left to them except the privilege of not being sold as slaves. To bring Rhode Island under his despotism, he went to Providence and demanded the surrender of the charter. But the discussion lasting into the night, the lights were suddenly put out, and in the darkness the precious document disappeared and was hidden in an oak which became sacred as the Charter Oak. One day, however, there sailed into Boston Harbor an English ship bringing the glad tidings of the Revolution and the order to proclaim William and Mary. That order was joyfully obeyed. Andros fell like Jeffreys, and like Jeffreys had a narrow escape from popular vengeance. William III had saved the liberties of Europe from Louis XIV, but his own trade was to be a king, and he soon had a Tory parliament. After some deliberation, he restored the charter of Massachusetts, not, however, without serious changes. The governor was thenceforth to be appointed by the king, not elected by the people. Toleration was secured to all religions except the Roman Catholic. Now, here's a good one. Listen. The qualification for the franchise was to be property, not church membership. All right, that goes out to Mr. Bill and Running Media Institute and everybody else. The Puritanism, which was its informing spirit, was now rapidly dying in the colony, as after the fall of the Commonwealth it had died in the mother country. The Baptists set up an altar against God's altar and would not allow it to be pulled down. Now, let me throw in, you can take from that whatever you like, okay? In Boston at this time, according to Dunton, a roving bookseller, there were 13 bookstores, a formidable mine under the foundations of the theocratic edifice. Presently, Unitarianism raised its head and in time possessed itself of the government of the university, Harvard. Though the Virginian exaggerated, who said that New England you had to put in a herring head with every stalk of corn to make it grow, much of the soil was niggered. Now, by the way, I'm not doing the racist stuff. That's not racist, because he ain't saying nothing about color. He's saying about condition. Okay. The American farmer is now deserting it for the fertile expanses of the West. Now, let me throw in, again, people seem to think that you only lived in a colony and you only lived in a city. That is not how this went. People got tired of the indentured servitude and everything and ran for the fucking hills the first chance they got. And when they got out and got set up with their trading posts and the fur trappers and everybody else, they built little communities and towns and had nothing to fucking do with the United States or any of the fucking colonies. Nothing. Later, the colonial governments and everybody showed up. That's what happened. That's how hard that is. And claimed it was theirs. And after a couple of generations of fucking with people, it became theirs because the descendants of the originals are fucking stupid. They believed it. That's all there is to this. The climate, too, was rigorous. That land may almost rank with the marshes of Holland and the lagoons of Venice as a stern nurse of the industrial virtues. Now, almost everything he talks about is in the corporate company world. He doesn't really talk about you throughout this. He's talking about the plantation owners and everything else, as if no other order exists beyond that. Okay? Now, people confuse the government with themselves. It has no, I'm not part of the plantation corporations or anything else. So people need to start making the distinction, okay? The political subdivision, the corporations, and all that. All right? Yet New England raised enough to supply with farm products not only herself, but the West Indies. Now, hold on. I thought they couldn't do anything. I thought they wasn't able to survive. See, he contradicts himself a bunch in here. There was as yet hardly a legal profession. Now, I'm going to throw in that you do know that they would hang a lawyer from a tree because they considered them scumbags. Well, they didn't want lawyers anyway. They didn't want you to defend yourself. They wanted you, and I'll show you here in just a second, they wanted you to do whatever the fuck you were told. The corporations, the plantation owners. Okay? So they threw out the Bible. Bing, there's the law. Everything written in there is the law. We, the corporation, will define how this goes. You didn't have a choice except to leave. Okay? All right. And when people were successful in creating their own towns and their own colonies way away from them, they had to change the rules and suck you back into it. Okay? Okay. The people had hitherto been judged not by men learned in the laws, but by the magistrate. The magistrate, as they had been in Israel. Okay. Now, I'll throw in the ABA Journal of 1920 and the Courts Nisi Prius and the magistrates. That's right. Meantime, far to the south and for some time separated from New England by a Dutch plantation, in a land and an air physically more genial, morally less happy, another group of communities had been growing up. These were colonies of the same mother country as New England, but widely different from her in religious, social, and political character, destined presently to be joined to her in an ill-starred union, then to come to an inevitable rupture with a confederation of which she was the soul, and after a desperate struggle to be subjugated and re-annexed. New England was the leading shoot, the molding force, the prevailing spirit, but Virginia, the queen of the southern group, was the elder colony. Note, now I'm going to throw in, sure they were. What he actually means, what he's actually saying is rich men fought with each other because they were rich and wanted more rich, using you. That's all there is to that. This man, John Smith, knew what a colony was and how it differed from a gold hunt. The Virginia Company sent out supplies and reinforcements, above all a cargo of maids as wives for the settlers, and the colony struggled into permanent existence. Now, Let me throw in, we call that white slavery. A cargo of maids or indentured servitude by force. Right, servants. Servants aren't slavery. No. Yeah, I don't think so. Anyway, then came Lord Delaware as governor with a state rather beyond the needs and means of the colony, whereat rough settlers grumbled, but with power and will to put down misrule, right, for the betterment of everybody. Even though they were fine, didn't need him. They existed before he showed up, right? Himself regularly attended church in full dress with his officers and council, and a guard of 50 halberdiers in red cloaks, and sat in the choir in a green velvet chair with a velvet cushion to kneel on. Yes, because it's all for your betterment, you see. It's all, because this is what makes a man American. Man, you're on bottom, working a plantation, he ain't. Right, because all the aristocracy, there wasn't no idle aristocracy. No. Though no longer gold seekers but real colonists, the men of Virginia were not such colonists as the Puritans. They were more akin in character to the Spaniard on the south of them who made the Indian work for him than to the New Englander who worked for himself. Now, hold on. Did you not? This is what I like about this old boy. He jumps around a lot of issues, and he only partially fleshes out the white, black, red slave trade that built the colonies. Those that were press ganged and everything. Because after all, people worked for themselves, right? What did the law of Massachusetts say about bondage? They worked for themselves. Yeah, okay. Important. Listen. To work for them, they had from the first a number of indentured servants or bondsmen, jailbirds, many of them, some kidnapped by press gangs in the streets of London, all of a depraved character. Now, let me throw in, please notice that they were so depraved they were not killed, but enslaved to work ultra-rich plantation estates in the North and the South. Now, the author forgets to mention that while debtors' prisons were banned here, nobody seemed to turn down those debtors off the ships as estate slaves. Okay. Afterwards came in ever-increasing volume of African slavery, the destined bane of Virginia and her ultimate ruin. Thus were formed the three main orders of Virginian society: the planter oligarchy, the poor whites, or as the Negro dubbed them, mean white trash, and the Negro slaves. Okay. Now, I want you to understand that the whites were getting away from them. To hell with you. They was leaving. You had Kentucky and Tennessee. How long were people there before the company decided to chase them down? Well, if you ain't got no workers on your plantation because they said, fuck you, I quit, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to get slaves from somewhere else now, ain't they? So don't get mad at Africans. Don't get mad at yourself because you walked away. Who do you got to blame for that shit? Yeah, not hard, is it? That's right. Now, again, the author is not making the distinction of all the colonies doing this. Now, they only changed the words around, okay, of what you are. Instead, he's harping solely upon Virginia and the South on the slave stuff. Remember, it was okay to be scammed into debt bondage and work for the estate plantations in the North because they magically considered that as it doesn't really count. Okay, it doesn't really count as slavery. It doesn't really count. And after succeeding generations, you're so fucking stupid you would work for them for nothing. That's how this went. You gotta laugh because this is fucking stupid and people go for it every time. Middle class, in the proper sense of the term, there could hardly be. Now, I'll throw in the next version of the change-up will be when they bring in the middle class underneath the plantation owners, which are just stupider workers that will actually believe their fortunes are tied up in working for this dumbass. Administrators and everything like that. They were created as a buffer between you and the plantation owners. That's all there is. That's it. That's all there is to it. And the reason that was designed, so if in case any war happens, you'll never blame the guys who actually did this. You'll blame the middle class. And the guys that did this, that do this bullshit, will burn the middle class out on you because the middle class is fucking stupid. They'll believe this. They'll believe that their fortunes and their lives are actually tied up in complete and utter bullshit. That's right, kids. That's how hard this is. It's a matter of faith and belief, and stupid faith and stupid fucking belief. That's all there is to it. The poor whites were destined, after 2 centuries of a barbarous and debased existence, to end in a blaze of glory as the heroic infantry of the South. Yeah, let's say it like that, right? Well, I hate to tell you, it's true. It's true. Don't uphold the South, people. They're fucking scam artists the same as the North. Okay? Virginia was not like New England, cooped between mountains and the sea, nor was the soil niggard, though it was rapidly exhausted by slave labor. The planters were far apart, taking each of them instead of the small lots of the New Englander, large tracts of land. Now, I'm going to tell you, they're only using 2 different models, okay? They're both together. The plantation owners of the North and South would instantly band together against you. Instantly. To this day, instantly. Caterpillar would hire a private army to come whack out all of your family. All of them. Root and branch, if they thought they needed to. That doesn't count Goldman Sachs or anybody else. So you people better realize this shit, okay? All right. So the Hostess Twinkies would do it. Right, they would. They fucking would. Population, instead of being condensed, as in New England, was scattered. And life was isolated instead of being intensely social. Well, yes and no. Yes and no. There were no townships nor township politics. The divisions were shires or colossal parishes. The parish, as a designation at once ecclesiastical and administrative, was adopted from England. And who did they administrate to? Themselves? No, you fucking moron. You. That's right, slave. The country being intersected by rivers, each plantation could have, and prided itself on having, a wharf of its own, at which, as a port of entry, ships could load and unload. Now, let me throw in the plantation estate corporations under the Virginia companies and successors are the ones who actually own the ports. Don't follow the money. Follow the land registration and the titles. Okay? You don't get to say the United States Corporation own it. They don't own shit. Who has the original fucking titles? Follow them back. And when it comes into the late 1800s, when they started running the huge real estate scam of, quote, land registration, unquote, because it didn't exist prior to it. So when they started running these huge scams of land registration, find out who owns it. Because what you'll see is the justice system, just us, starting to boot out justices of the peace and rooting common lawyers out, as well as the smaller owners, the plantation owners. As each planter dealt directly with the old country, there was no great seaports nor centers of distribution. Virginia's staple was tobacco, which could be well grown by slave labor and required large estates, because it was exhausting to the soil. This narcotic, now watch, now it's a narcotic. Well, who's saying it's a narcotic, right? Why are they calling it a narcotic? Now, throw away that science bullshit. I already know what you're going to say. No, who is applying this definition to tobacco? And for what purpose? It's real easy. I want you to listen. This narcotic, the demand for which increased fast in Europe, was, as King James I thought, the diabolical source of Virginia's wealth and grandeur. Note, in other words, it was fine as long as the king made the big bucks. It is not fine and is considered evil when he does not make the big taxes off of it. I want you to think of this. That's right. An official personage, practically minded, to whom a Virginian delegation. Now, he doesn't specify who this person is, the official personage, to whom a Virginian delegation had commended a measure for the good of souls, replied, "Damn your souls, grow tobacco." An attempt was made to introduce silk growing, but it came to nothing. Industry of the higher kinds is shut out by slavery. The population to which it gives birth would be socially and politically fatal, as well as economically alien to a slave-owning community. Note, Bernie Mandeville is an excellent source of who magically decides what is industry of higher kinds and what is acceptable. Okay? It shows the crudity of Virginian commerce that tobacco was not only the staple but the currency of the province, long after New England had discarded the use of wampum or bullets as money. Now, let me throw in, and here comes the magic higher forms of currency. Anything that is individually made and invested with your personal time and effort is considered crude currency. You should really trade paper or gold, right? Either printed or coined by the state or feds, but never, ever a leaf of tobacco exactly the same size and worth more. Now, isn't that odd? As we all know, when a third party begins to insert themselves into individual trade with any form of currency, what happens next? Slavery, which is probably why they use paper money and gold and silver. A third party currency. So, see, if you're taking care of your own stuff, it's considered crude. Yeah, it's considered crude to their legal corporate model. Right? Such was the birth of that famous planter aristocracy which made so desperate a fight against democracy. First in the political arena, then on many a field of battle. Now let me throw in here, seriously, did he not explain to you the New Englanders did exactly the same thing? Exactly the same thing. But that's okay. It dwelt, save when it was debating, dancing, or racing at the Capitol, in lonely grandeur beside its broad rivers and private wharves, in mansions styled baronial, and in what it deemed manorial state, fed by the labor of slaves and surrounded by the servility of poor whites. Yeah, no shit. It was hospitable, as rich men without neighbors and craving for company always are. Of course, well, let me throw in here that's exactly what a crowded up northern city is. Of rich men who's got a shitload of neighbors who go buy powdered fucking wigs like retards. Aristocratic fucking tards. Okay, but somehow one's better than the other, when they're exactly the same thing, which is pure shit and general functional retardation. Of course, living by the sweat of other men's brows, it was free from anything that is sordid in the industrial or commercial character. Not parsimony, but prodigality was its fault, and while it was master of many slaves, it was apt itself to be the slave of debt. The appearance of slavery on the scene when other slavery had almost disappeared from the face of the civilized world. What he's saying is actually brute force slavery had almost disappeared from the civilized world, but certainly not contractual. Okay? That's still running on your books today. Opened a new chapter of evil. It was the slavery of color, indelible, without hope of fusion, utterly debased and debasing, and of all slaveries the most degraded. In other words, it was exactly the same as the North. We just don't talk about it or, quote, see it that way, unquote. To quiet all doubt, it was expressly enacted that conversion to Christianity was no bar to slavery. Now, this is me. This is the distinct changeover from the religious corporate ownership and rule to the strict estate north or south state franchise of the rich owners, corporation ownership. Not a real change in any type of ownership at all. The men were all the same as before. In fact, it was simply a change in model from ecclesiastical to strictly corporate, to unburden the owners from all liability or revenge, because you cannot blame anybody and hold anybody accountable in a democracy. You can't. It's never been done, to my knowledge. Nobody gets an actual death penalty in a democracy except for you. The runners and the owners don't. So why the fuck would you use something that you don't get justice out of? What the fuck is wrong with you? Intermarriage between whites and blacks was forbidden as incest. Ooh, yeah. Think about what they're actually saying. I'm not saying you're better than a black or black's better than a white. I'm saying they said it's the same as fucking your sister. Whoa! So that the gulf between the races was impassable. If a woman bore children to a white man, she carried them with her into slavery. Now, this is still indentured, also white indentured servitude and white slavery. Okay? All right. Sharecropping's the same damn thing. And an American historian tells us that the offspring of men of station might be seen in the slave mart. So, I'm not going to state the obvious that Thomas Jefferson or any of his buddies were no less brutal than any other plantation owner in all the respects. No more honorable and no more just. They don't give a fuck about you. They never said you. Ever. Ever. In none of their writings. They're certainly not more truthful or wise. They're talking about how do we keep this game running and fuck everybody. That's all they ever said. Right? They don't care about their fucking kids. If it was a half-breed, they'd hawk the motherfucker on the market just to get them out of the way. Wow. Why would anybody ever consider these fucking people to be anything more than the scumbags that they were? All right, I don't get it. In the household, the relation between master and slave no doubt was often patriarchal and kind. Though even there, the slave can hardly have risen morally or intellectually to a higher condition than that of a well-treated horse or dog. And I'm going to throw in, that's exactly the way you are treated now. The same as your great-grandpappy. Black, white, red, it don't fucking matter. One of these days, you'll figure it out. Even with regard to the indentured servants, the law was harsh and degrading. Now, I'm going to throw in the law of language again. It's a fun one. Instead of saying my slave by theft or screw job, it is inherent that a huckster, shyster, scumbag will immediately change the terminology, in this case from simple slave to indentured servants, to soften the general bullshittery and scam. All right, next section is important. They were liable, the indentured servants, to the penalty of branding, and their terms of service might for delinquencies, real or pretended, be prolonged to perpetual servitude. Now that's North and South. Just get over that. The political development of the southern colonies, like their industrial and social development, presented a strong contrast to that of the New England Commonwealth. Now, I'm going to tell you, the only actual distinction in a democracy of rich corporate owners with willing indentured slaves via false contracting versus rich corporate owners with enforced indentured slaves via forced contracting is nil. There is no real difference. Seriously, the minor Ponzi scam distinctions you will find in history are simply justifications of one Carney Barker versus another while they both fuck you. Okay, that's easy. The industrial and social character of a community is sure, in spite of constitutional forms, to draw the political character with it. In other words, lying, busting contracts, defrauding, and scamming via social reconstruction to enforce corporate cohesion, or scarlet letters is acceptable in forced slavery and economic models to corporations. Why would you back the motherfuckers if that's what they do to you? All right. A governor wielded more personal power than was left to the king at home, and exercised his veto freely when that of the king had been virtually resigned. He also exercised freely his military powers and his powers of appointment. Your government, all of them. The worst thing you can have is appointment, because you get nothing but shitbags, all right? A sure sign of an eternal corporate servitude is the power of magical appointment from the above classes. See, you're so fucking stupid. That's not coming from your class. They're appointing people of their fucking class. All right? You actually call that bullshit representation instead of fucking stupidity and indentured servitude. And you get what you pay for, and you ain't paying for it. What the fuck? Really? The assembly, however, retained the power of the purse. Well, magically, of course, right? He's not telling you how this game just keeps going around, revolving the same fucking thing with different words. The suffrage was at one time general. Afterwards, it was limited to fucking property. To keep you out. In all Ponzi pyramids, the originators and creators of it use in general scams to gather willing followers who create a hardcore sinner kook brigade that will defend the scam at all costs. Ron Paul is proof. The WWF wrestling is proof. Joe Rogan and UFC is proof. Okay, in the real fucking world of this. Afterwards, in order to block more slave units from overtaking the Ponzi and outvoting the original subscribers or investors, it is well known you simply magically change some of the legal law wording and present the newly redefined law to everyone underneath you to kick your ass out of it. That's how hard that is. So welcome to voting. But nominal freedom or limitations mattered little, since power was really in the hands of the planters, on whom most of the poor whites were dependent. Now, let me throw in, if you look at the North, who are you dependent on there? It's always the same bullshit, because it's always bullshit. The planters of each shire administered local government and justice in conclaves like the English quarter sessions, and with more than the authority of the English squire. In oligarchical Virginia, taxation took the form of a poll tax, whereas in Republican New England, now hold on, now it's a republic. It wasn't a democracy earlier where the corporations tell you what to do, like they tell you to self-tax. Fucking idiots. Whereas in Republican New England, people were taxed according to their means. Now, I'm going to throw in, the author seems to have forgotten what he wrote 30 pages earlier regarding taxation of the North. Right. The oligarchs were not the more inclined to submit to political slavery because they owned slaves. The parson, like everybody else in the primitive state of commerce, you see this keeps cropping up, huh? Well, corporations deal with commerce. That's all it is, money, greed. Was paid not in money, but in tobacco. Because it's, by the way, that's evil, because they said so. That's you don't take rocks, motherfucker, you take money. You don't take tobacco. What? In a slave state, a system of free schools or general education on any footing would not only have been uncongenial, it would have been dynamite. Now, I'm going to throw in, you might find the real fight is how far willing slavery could be combined with forced slavery. And that is embodied in the 14th Amendment of the Bill of Contractual and Federal Employee Rights in the United States Corporation of District of Columbia Federal Reserve District. In fact, it has been the only fight in town at the top since day one here, and day one way back when, Huckster v. Shyster, so on and so forth. Down here, they were running two different models just to see what the fuck they could do. So if we don't educate you whatsoever, well, you'll educate each other. That didn't turn out well. because I had rebellions down here the same as they did everywhere else. The people just said, fuck it, I quit, and they ran away. I'd rather go live with a barbarian Indian than work for you. Up north, they said, oh, okay, well, we'll give them the magic of, quote, public education, unquote, where you do what we say and we'll teach you what the Bible says, because it's the only book that counts. We said so. Well, that's okay. Okay, so we're going to go to Harvard? Well, you won't allow me to go to Harvard because I'm not one of the families that you like. Well, interesting. I don't have enough money. I'm not a good enough employee to go. It's always the same, people. And they're not going to teach you anything except how to work on the fucking plantation somewhat effectively. And they're not even good at that. Jesus. Social Reconstruction 101. How to scam everyone. Okay? Virginia had, of all the colonies, the best reputation at the English court. It was royalist to the core and thoroughly loyal. Of this title, the Old Dominion is a monument. There was, however, a Puritan section, which, having raised its head under the Commonwealth, resisted the absolutist and Anglican reaction and could only be put down by force. Now, that's the little companies popping up everywhere. They'll call them Puritan, absolute. What? It doesn't matter. They're all companies. They all pop up and fight with each other. That's how it is. That's how it is now. It's not nearly as unified as you think. They really want it to be. But they're getting ready to learn that the United Nations just don't carry near as much weight as they'd like. That was the time of Governor Berkeley, who so frankly uttered his sentiments on the subject of free schools and printing. He was the model of a royalist governor, able and apparently beneficent in his way, but a devout believer in prerogative and an extermination of Puritans and Republicans. His vigor brought on a rebellion which seems to have had its origin among the freemen of the poorer class and was headed by a Virginian Gracchus named Bacon. Jamestown was razed to the ground by the insurgents, but Bacon died suddenly in mid-career. His following, drawn from a small and feeble section, at once broke up, and the governor held a bloody assize. Now, I'm telling you here and now, nobody will listen to me, but a grand jury is a grand assize, and a trial jury is an assize. They take the measure. They're tax collectors. But one of these days you'll figure it out. That's the way it's set up with the Roman civil and everything. Though technically it's common law and not exactly Roman civil. But it works together, trust me. But anyway, he held a bloody assize, which is said to have brought on him a contemptuous exclamation from Charles II, who was not a man of blood except when mercy would give more trouble. Important, listen, Bacon's rebellion seems to have been brought on partly by a suspicion that the governor had an underhand connection for commercial purposes with the Indians and was disposed to protect them against the whites. Maryland, in its origin, was in two respects peculiar. It was founded not by a chartered company, but by a proprietor, and its projector was a Roman Catholic. Lord Baltimore, a statesman who had taken great interest in colonization and had convinced himself that companies failed through mismanagement and greed, obtained a grant of the territory from the crown. Lord Baltimore dying, his son Cecil founded Maryland. Jesuits came out with the first colonists and began their missionary work among the Indians. Neither of the peculiar features, however, proved lasting. Important, listen closely, the proprietor, whose authority was by his patent that of a Prince Palatine, found it necessary to compound with the English tendencies of the free settlers and allow himself to be reduced to the position of a constitutional ruler, with an assembly of the usual kind, in which was vested the all-important power of taxation. I cannot overstress the treatise on American citizenship and what it says about taxation. Okay? By the victory of Puritanism over Charles I in England, Puritanism in Maryland, where it formed an element of the motley population, was incited to strike for power, and it defeated the party of the Pope and the Proprietary in a little pitched battle at Providence. With the Restoration returned the government of the Proprietary, well administered by Charles Calvert, the 3rd Lord Baltimore, under whom religious quarrels were hushed, toleration reigned, tobacco was grown, and the province prospered. But the Revolution in England brought another rising of the Protestants against toleration of the Catholics, and in the end Maryland was made a royal province, received a royal governor, and was settled politically on the regular model with a council and representative assembly. I mean, do you people not get how this works? Okay, it's a fucking corporation, always has been. Maryland was drawn within the fatal circle of the slave states and became the domain of a planter class like that of Virginia, but less oligarchical. The Carolinas, like Maryland, were a proprietary colony, founded by a group of leading men in England, to whom Charles II made a rather blind grant of a territory already in part occupied by settlers. Yes, now you're going to learn concurrent jurisdiction. I'm already here, and some asshole comes through and says, no, I bought it all. You're part of me now, and we're changing the way it's done. Well, and you'll say that's never happened. What the fuck do you think the United States and the United Nations just did to you in 1961? They've already done it. They've done it a whole bunch more times. Jesus. And who appear not only to have been desirous of gain, but ambitious of founding a model community. Among them was Shaftesbury, whose hand we seem to trace in a special clause peculiar to this charter, which in consideration of the distance from home authorized the proprietaries to establish any religion they chose. A curious indication of the political character of the English state religion. For an ideal constitution, the proprietaries applied to the wisdom of Locke. And the wisdom of Locke, and they're talking about John Locke, gave them, yeah, that's right, from Lost. John Locke, no, not that John Locke. He thought highly of himself as a theorist, if you want to call it like that. A bullshitterist is what I call him. Anyway, gave them a grand model, which, especially considering that it was intended for the rough population of a new settlement, may be regarded as the most awful of warnings to a political castle builders. You can't get no more plain than that. It is an ineffable structure of the feudal type, with a hierarchy of hereditary landowners under the names of landgraves and caciques, or cacique. I'm not sure how that is said. The latter name being probably intended as a complement to native sentiment, a division of the land into seigneurs, or seigneuries, okay, and what seems incredible as a proposal of Locke, a race of hereditary tenants attached, like Valines regardant, to the soil. Oh yes. To keep government in the hands of intelligence and property seems to have been the philosopher's aim. This scheme the proprietaries actually tried to put in force. It could produce nothing but disgust, revolt, and confusion. In the course of the political squabbles which inevitably ensued, South Carolina was severed from North Carolina and transferred from the proprietaries to a royal governor. Into North Carolina, attracted by toleration, came Huguenots from France, persecuted Covenanters from Scotland, and other religious refugees whose charter, together with the climate and husbandry of an upland country, was the saving of North Carolina, so that though in the slave group she was scarcely of it. South Carolina had also a sinister connection with the slave-owning and buccaneering West Indies. The West Indies is a company, okay, kids? Just like the East Indies, okay? Corsairs such as Captain Kidd and Blackbeard found shelter in her ports. Her slave code transcended even that of Virginia in cruelty, and expressed still more vividly the terrors of a dominant race. Now, I'm going to throw in, by race, he does indeed mean class. Color never meant anything to these people, and it does not now. A good slave, if willing, even better, is a good slave. And color has nothing to do with that. Everyone who found a slave abroad without a pass was to flog him on the spot. Now, I'm going to throw in, doesn't that sound like a driver's license to you? It damn sure does to me. All Negro houses were to be searched once a fortnight for arms and for stolen goods. Now, I'm going to throw in, I'll have to actually read it, but I bet you it doesn't say anything about Negroes. It does say slaves, but not Negroes. How much you want to bet? For the fourth larceny, a slave, see, not a Negro, a slave was to suffer death, and the kind of death was left to the discretion of the judge. Note, like now, actually, in the company courts. And by that, I mean the fines defeat the bullshit. That's right. For running away a fourth time, the slave was to undergo mutilation. For the willful murder of a slave, the penalty was a fine of 40 pounds. Well, they did it to you. Important, this is for Mr. Watt and y'all, a very specific part. Georgia was founded by the philanthropic General Oglethorpe. That's right, the Bill Gates of his day. Whose heart had been wrung with pity for the sufferings of debtors imprisoned under the barbarous law of those days. Note, nothing like a rich man to have pity. Couldn't have it before, couldn't have it after. Just had it for a little while. Right? Plus, I'm not saying he needed help with his plantation or anything. Think about it. Come on. Where are you going to get cheap labor? Well, there's a good deal. A shitload of debtors. Hey, all debtors, come work for me. That's all there is to it. Yeah. It was to be the refuge of the pauper and the bankrupts, and was to empty, and he says it, and it was to empty the workhouses of England. Another socially reconstructive boot falls. Boom. It wasn't to do the workhouses, it was to empty the fucking prisons. Okay? Because England's sitting at home saying, we've got all these assholes because we're running these retarded laws. It's to force immigration to the fucking company colonies so they would have workers because their turnover rate's so high because they either kill all of them or they fucking quit and run away. This is not difficult, man. All right? Another object was the erection of a bulwark against the Spaniards of Florida. Now, notice, it's a good thing they suddenly had an influx of free and extremely broke men who would fight, well, for free. For good old General Oglethorpe. Think of that. Yeah, he got a free fucking army that was broke and desperate. Nice, right? Who could either choose the fucking gallows in debtor's prison or choose to go work for this asshole and go kill Spaniards and Indians and whoever the hell else he said. Unluckily, the settlers chosen instead of being laborers were men who had failed in trade. In other words, scam artists, and were good for nothing as husbandmen. Better elements of population came in. Highlanders, Moravians, Protestants of Salzburg expelled by their persecuting prince, bishop. Note, now I'm going to throw this in. I've been waiting to get to this one. If you are unaware, people, we were the first Australia. You were the first dumping ground for every prisoner, malcontent, dissident, and kook fucking nut job. And that is the cream of the crop, what they call the cream of the crop, the real fucking nut jobs, up at the very, very top. We are just people that get caught in the fucking middle. They get shipped around to go fucking colonize for them, like we're getting ready to do to Africa, South America, and everybody else. All right, we were the first Australia, not y'all. All right, we're full of fucking prisoners. We were, in short, a dumping ground for everyone else that they didn't like. Oklahoma, I'm going to tell you a story real quick. The Badlands was Oklahoma. All right, nobody wanted the fucking Badlands. Then magically the territory of Oklahoma is declared, all right, by the United States and everybody. People nobody fucking knows, by proprietors. And after they started whacking out all the fucking Indians, they dumped them here. And people that didn't want nothing to do with the fucking states or anybody else ran here. Way before any fucking land rush. All right? And after a whole bunch of funny handshakes and kooky paychecks, the state of Oklahoma magically appeared. Overnight. Magic voting and everything. So yes, Oklahoma is a very small microcosm for the entire United fucking States. Nobody wanted it until they ran out of room and dumped everybody there. Or drove everybody the fuck out to here. That was part of the point. Okay? The whole fucking point. And they showed up later and said, it's ours, by the way. And everybody looks at each other and says, what the fuck? I don't remember voting over this. Well, you did. So anyway. But the shiftless and lazy immigrants called at once for rum, which had been prohibited, and for slaves to do their work. By the workers, the entrance of slavery was opposed, but the climate and the contagion of neighboring colonies prevailed. Important. Listen to this. Model colonies are apt to come to nothing except as they may enlist settlers of high character and thus lay a good social foundation. All right, are you getting it? It's like Walmart saying, come work for me for $3 an hour and absolutely no benefits. You'll get 10% off. You can buy a Coke or a candy during your shitty 10-minute break that's non-union. Why would you work for a fucking shitty colony like that? That's literally what this is. The group of middle states was formed around the Delaware, New York, and Chesapeake Bays. Pennsylvania, as we all know, was the philanthropic utopia. Yeah, that's not good. Of the renowned and somewhat enigmatic character whose name it bears. Now, he kind of attempts to skirt around William Penn, okay? All right. But he does and he doesn't, okay? Quakerism was by this time clothed and in its right mind, of course. It had, in other words, it had fought to get corporate pull, and it did. It had passed from George Fox to Barclay. It was becoming commercial, even eminently commercial. Sound like Mormons to you? Well, it sounds like all of them since they're 501c. And its political quietism, which in Penn, and by that he means William Penn, assumed the form of an equivocal connection with the court, distinguished it favorably from the political sects in the eyes of the Stuarts. Partly in satisfaction of a debt due from the crown to his estate, Penn was made Lord of Pennsylvania with almost kingly power, including those of peace and war, which he, of course, intended to exercise only in the interest of peace. His scheme of government was popular, and I actually think he was a decent dude for all intents and purposes. I could be wrong. He could have been a fucking Fruit Loop. I don't know. I ain't Pennsylvanian. He renounced for himself and his successors any power of doing mischief. Well, that's good. Since he's king, he could just announce he can later. What the fuck does that, mean? That the will of one man might not hinder the good of the whole country. And by country, he means Pennsylvania. The other characteristics which he impressed upon his settlement were religious toleration, a mild criminal law with the reformation of the criminal in view, and good treatment of the Indians. Murder was the only capital offense. If I remember rightly, Pennsylvania was also the one that built the prisons, and they tried to eventually figure out how to gas prisoners in their cells. You know, like you can pronounce a guy, well, you don't go to the electric chair, they just gas you in your fucking cell. That was way back when. I mean, they weren't dumb. They knew the prisoner dilemma quite well. They were weird motherfuckers. Anyway, to Penn's good treatment of the Indians, his colony owed peace in that quarter and uninterrupted progress. Slavery was not excluded. Now, that's right, it was not excluded. Contractual slavery was not excluded. So, let me also throw in that Penn State ran her own money. She did a 10-year stretch with her paper dollars that she slowly devalued, and it worked just fine. Zero problems with debt. Zero, because we all know it's all bullshit. It's just faith-based, okay? All right. So, anyway, it's how do you get the retards to work for you? Well, it sounds like William Penn and his council and everything said, if we do it like this, they won't try to fucking kill us and burn us down, so let's do it like this. They actually use their heads, is what I mean. That Penn himself once held slaves at will, though not as last, remains to show. But he strove, though in vain, to secure for the slaves the right of legal marriage. He tried to, all right? I'm going to throw in much is commercially corporate left unsaid right in that sentence. Go read the book, you lazy bastards. I added this part in here just to see if anyone noticed, and I bet you do not notice. Penn, in spite of his philanthropy and liberalism, became embroiled like other governors and proprietaries with his lieges. His son, whom evil associations had made a libertine, renounced Quakerism in wrath at the treatment of his father by this sect. Toleration made Pennsylvania a religious museum. Now, you're really going to enjoy this. You're going to really enjoy this. Boy, they come out with some good stuff sometimes. In it, besides the Quakers, were Anglicans, Lutherans, Scotch Presbyterians, Palatines, Ridge Hermits, Dunkers, and Pietists. Oh, and there's more. Someday I'll find that other book that has all the good stuff. Power, with a large share of the commerce and wealth of which Philadelphia became the seat, was in the hands of the Quakers, who as rulers were prudent, thrifty, and always averse from war. To war, however necessary, they would contribute only under the form which satisfied their own consciences of a gift to the government for the use of which the conscience of the government was to answer, or as on one occasion they did, as a supply for the purchase of bread, flour, wheat, or other grain, the other grain being understood to be gunpowder. Their institutions sustained their reputation for philanthropy, which means basically pity and mercy on their slaves. I guess is what you call it. You and me. And by them, the first lunatic asylum in America was founded, which is so great that later on, forced lobotomies, electroshock, none of that weird shit ever happened. Thanks, Quakers, for setting that up. New York, which its ample territory and possession of the most magnificent harbors, have now made the Empire State and the seat of the commercial capital. Now remember, I'm going to throw this in. Capital is spelled in the creditor sense. C-A-P-I-T-A-L. Not capital. T-O-L. Remember that. Of the Union was originally New Netherlands, a Dutch colony founded in the golden age of Holland's naval greatness. Delaware, the neighboring state, was a colony of Sweden founded in the glorious days of Gustavus Adolphus. The Dutchman, by his superior power, mastered the Swede. The Englishman mastered the Dutchman. Dutch colonization seems to have been barely on par with Dutch commerce and seamanship. New Netherlands was dominated by the patroons And here you're going to go into the anti-renter wars and stuff, okay? All right. Magnates invested with vast grants of land who exercised seigneurial sway and lived in a seigneurial state. The ancient title is still cherished, and about a half a century ago, that claim of a patroon for services to be rendered by the tenants upon what had once been his domain gave birth to a petty civil war. Now, that was the anti-renters or the renters' war, okay? All right. There is still a Dutch Reformed church, and an old lady being told that Dutch was to be dropped in order that the character of the church might be universal, replied that she did not want the church to be universal. It was the church of the old Dutch families of that state. After going through the usual political struggles and sufferings, a temporary suspension of her liberties under James II, and a satrap Andros, followed by a tragicomic revolution in which Leisler, a patriot leader, mounted the scaffold of Russell and Algernon Sidney, New York settled down politically into the regular form of the English Constitution adapted to the colonies. And with the usual constitutional bickerings between the governor and the assembly, the quarrel being chiefly here as elsewhere about money. New Jersey was created by dismemberment from New York. It had a motley population and hardly any history distinct from that of the larger state. It became a country of gentlemen farmers with a peasantry. It received, however, a colony of persecuted Covenanters, which made it one of the chief seats of Presbyterianism, and of which Princeton University may be regarded as a noble memorial. The population of the New England colonies was almost purely English, and reflected the virtues and faults of English character, as seen in the Englishmen of the middle class, though with Puritan and colonial modifications. The population of the Middle States was very mixed. It comprised, besides Englishmen, detachments or waifs of almost every Protestant nation and church in Europe. Scotch Highlanders and Lowlanders, Scotch-Irish, French Huguenots, Germans from different parts of Germany, Moravians, Dutch, Swedes, Finns, and a few Jews. Everywhere there was a constitution after the British model, with a governor representing the king or proprietary, and a representative assembly with two houses answering to the two houses of Parliament. Local self-government in the Middle States was a mean between the intense local life of the New England townships and political languor of the Virginian Shire, or languor, however you want to say it. The social code was far less strict than in Puritan New England. Slavery everywhere existed by law, but it was kept down by the ascendancy of free labor and by the nature of the products. Now, by free labor, I'm going to tell you real clear. Come to New York and work for us, and it's indentured servitude. That's all there is to it. That's what they call free labor. It's not free. Free is when I go work for a man and get whatever I want in payment, and we're done. Free labor is not free when a third party steps in and forces you to pay anything because they said so. All right? So there is no free labor anything anywhere in this fucking country except the underground black market. That the Negro in New York was a slave appeared with dire distinctiveness when, in consequence of a vague alarm of incendiarism in New York City, upon evidence utterly disreputable and without fair trial, 13 Negroes were burnt at the stake and 18 were hanged. A Catholic priest accused of instigating the Negroes was with them judicially murdered. With James II, royal tyranny ceased, but parliamentary tyranny began. Parliament, now the supreme power, made itself the legislative organ of a commercial interest. animated by that blind and unscrupulous greed which has been the bane and disgrace of commerce and continues to animate the monopolist at the present day. By the Trade and Navigation Acts, England sought to engross not only the carrying trade but the general trade of her colonies and shut them out of the markets of the world. In doing this, she only followed the practice of the time and gave the effect to the belief universally accepted and endorsed even by Montesquieu that colonies were planted for the commercial benefit of the imperial country. The real interest even of the imperial country were sacrificed, as Adam Smith showed, to those of the merchants who were the principal instigators of the policy. The colonists were not allowed to make woolens, steel, hats, or any other articles by the manufacture of which they would compete with the mother country. This seemed no injustice to Chatham, who proclaimed the right of the imperial country to restrain the colonies from manufacturing even a horseshoe or a hobnail. Royal claims to trees of a certain size, as the Percocet of the Royal Navy, had been at one time a just cause of discontent. Now, in this section of the book, it should be very clear to you as well that the author is showing how the small corporate colonies either got sold off, uprooted, dismembered, merged, or drop-kicked to become either a royal colony directly under England or a proprietary colony under company, plantation, and estates. That never changed, ever. Only the proprietors did. In fact, the commercial restrictions seem to have been systematically disregarded. The Board of Trade, which had been called into existence by the growth of British commerce, acted as a guardian power of the British monopoly, having its sentinels in the colonial governors, on whose information it was always complaining of violations of the Trade and Navigation Acts. It had even the assurance to propose the abrogation of such colonial charters as remained, in order that the sweep of its actions might be unconfined, wrangling between the governor as the organ of prerogative and the assembly as the trustee of liberty. Whose liberty? The corporate liberty. The companies. Yeah. Went on in almost all the colonies, Virginia and Maryland almost alone enjoying, in their later days at least, something like political peace. The executive, fitfully supported by the home government, strove to make itself independent by a means of fixed revenues and salaries, while the assembly strove to keep the executive dependent on it by a system of annual grants. Nor was there less of niggardliness and fractiousness on the side of the assemblies than there was of a disposition to encroach on the side of the representatives of the crown. These embroilments are recounted with glee by historians, who deem them the training school of patriotism and preparatory for the struggle for independence. But such of you would seem to identify patriotism with resistance to government and to glorify revolution. Now, I'm going to throw in, you better be careful, patriots, and I mean P-A-Y, triots. You're not what you think you are. No, sir. I know who pulls your chain, your corporate one. Important. Revolution is the medicine, not the bread of nations. And genuine patriotism in ordinary times is loyal cooperation with authority. Which sounds good, but you ain't getting paid, are you? Nope. Fuck them. Of the governors sent out from England, some were bad, being men appointed from corrupt motives in an era of political corruption, ruined retainers of a party who came to retrieve their fortunes, sometimes by illicit means, or Englishmen ignorant of colonial character and unsuited in temper for their work. But some, as Bellamont in New York, Spotswood in Virginia, Calvert in Maryland, Archdale and Blake in Carolina, were good, and when the governor was good, it is not unlikely that for quiet citizens, for all to whom politics were not a trade or a game, his rule may be as beneficent and as moral as any of which this continent has seen or likely soon to see. One good service the governors and the home governor by which they were supported certainly did. They repressed the general tendency of the colonies to raise the wind by the issue of paper money. Now remember, the problem of evil fiat is not a problem at all. The model or form of the money is irrelevant and always has been, always will be. Who issues it, the reasons for only their own gain from such issuance. Those are the problems and always shall be. No matter the form, money is a tool used by upper classes to control the masses, to infiltrate and corrupt, to destroy cultures, and to launch fucking invasions. And it's to keep you on the dog chain. Appointments to subordinate offices in the colonies seem to have been abused, and the evil probably extended to the judiciary. Now, to me, there's no probable about it. The judiciaries are the first to be corrupted, not the last. Mutual ignorance was and always will be in itself fatal to transatlantic tutelage. It appears that in 1765, when the fatal era was approaching, there were over 40 newspapers in America. Important, very important. Admiral Warren, who had been acting with New Englanders, described them to the ministry as having the highest notions of the rights and liberties of Englishmen, and indeed as almost levelers. They were afraid that you would have the same rights as them, but they're not talking about you. They're talking about the other corporate guys, yeah. A suspicion that the plantations were now without thoughts of throwing off their dependents prevailed in England, and the lieutenant governor of New York exhorted his lieges to allay it by a grant of a fixed revenue. It is true that in reply the members of the assembly took it upon themselves to vouch that not one person in the province had any such thought or desire, for under what government could they be better protected or their liberties so well secured? The colonists of England did enjoy of political liberty a large, of personal liberty a full measure. Now, I want to remind you, nowhere in there did they talk about you except for slaves and indentured servitude. None of it was about you. You heard what it said. So, welcome to the Corporation, Game Theory, and Social Reconstruction Division. Sit down, stay a while. After all, you've always been here. When you're going to leave is up to your choice. End of Chapter 1.